Hello, thank you so much for having me today. It's really an honor to be here, and a special thanks to Ann Pasternak, of course, and NATO, and Shane Brennan, and the whole Creative Time team. For a number of years now, I've been using my visual work to explore 21st century political epistemology. In other words, when it comes to questions of democracy and politics, how do we know what we know? What is the status of truth claims? What is excluded from politics? What do those exclusions look like? And when I say, what do those exclusions look like, I mean that very literally. I've spent a huge amount of time looking at state secrecy in particular, and looking at the infrastructures of state secrecy. For some bodies of work, for example, some of these images, I've adopted techniques from astrophotography, using very, very high-powered lenses to photograph classified military and intelligence installations from extreme distances, up to about 60 miles. So in these photographs, we see these classified places, these places that don't exist for official purposes in one way or another, but we also see something else. In addition to being photographs of clandestine state facilities, these are photographs of what it looks like when you push the physical properties of vision as far as they will go. In other words, we're looking through so much heat, so much haze, and so much distance that light itself becomes undone. The colors of the spectrum become disentangled from one another, diffracted and defocused. What we begin to see is the limits of vision itself. I've also spent a lot of time looking at the structure of CIA and military front companies used to conduct covert actions, like the Extraordinary Rendition Program. This building in suburban Boston, for example, houses a company called Premier Executive Transport Services, which was an aviation company behind much of the CIA's rendition program. Attached to these companies are people like Colleen Bornt, Brian Dice, and Tyler Edward Tate, who are obviously not real people at all, but their negative existence is somehow crucial in structuring to some of the most brutal and violent forms of American exceptionalism. In corporate documents, forged signatures and passports, postal records, tax filings, and other bureaucratic refuse, I found a landscape of disappearance akin to secret air bases and weapon ranges of the West, a kind of bureaucratic sublime. One project involves collecting uniform badges and patches worn by the men and women charged with working on secret or black military projects. It's a patch for a spacecraft that went up a couple of years ago, and the Latin here says, "All your base are belong to us." This is part of a U.S. Space Command, right there in the bottom, that's Klingon for "don't ask." Another project involves working with amateur astronomers to develop a database of secret objects in Earth orbit and to photograph classified military and reconnaissance satellites as they glide through the night sky. For me, tracking these secret moons recalls Galileo's discovery of Jupiter's moons in the early 17th century. Moons that weren't supposed to be there, but existed nonetheless. Now, all of these projects use methodologies inspired by geographic thinking, and that's why I'm also here today to tell you something about geography. First of all, and I always like to make this point, is that geography is not really just about cartography or map making. And instead, geography is really a whole way of thinking that takes materiality as its starting point. In contrast to most literary or art theory, geography is about the ways in which humans sculpt the surface of the earth and are in turn sculpted by it. And this is geography's most important idea, that humans, just as humans play an active role in sculpting the world around us, the world around us also plays an active role in sculpting us. Humans, for example, have created agriculture, or have we? You could just as easily argue that agriculture has in fact created us. Human civilization, of course, would be fundamentally different if it were not for agriculture. The common sense understanding of agriculture is that it has to do with the human domestication and development of certain plants, like corn. But you could just as easily argue that agriculture is about corn learning how to domesticate humans, getting humans to provide for their reproduction and expansion of their own species. Another example is that human creates cities, but cities also create us. Cities tell us how to live our lives just as much as we tell cities how we want them constructed. Thus, the situationist axiom that any revolutionary form of human emancipation must begin with the remaking not simply of our consciousness, but with the remaking of the bricks and mortar of the city. Geography, I think, has become popular among artists because it provides us with a kind of theoretical way out of the 80s and 90s post-structuralism, and this is certainly why I got interested in geography. For geographers, the world is not simply a text or a system of signs. Textuality is but one part of an elaborate ontology of spatial and temporal becoming. Geography frees us from the textualist or representationalist approach towards cultural production and encourages us to think about materiality itself as an active historical agent. Beyond that, I think that geography is helpful because it suggests different ways of doing art and different ways of doing politics. If we think of cultural production or politics in terms of humans sculpting the surface of the earth and being sculpted by the surface of the earth, then geography actually gives us much more than just an analytic framework. It also provides us with a normative framework. Reconfiguring human relations means reconfiguring spatial relations, or to change politics means to change the spaces we inhabit. Liberating ourselves can only happen through the liberation of our cities and other spaces that we live in. And this, I think, is something that artists can be very good at. Not only imagining new ways of being, but actually creating the spaces wherein that is possible. And I think we've seen a number of people so far at this conference who've shown that. 2 years into the Obama administration, the relationship between materiality and human possibility has taken on crucial significance. How is it, for example, that the bricks at Guantanamo Bay are still standing? How is it that the rendition program continues? How is it that the assassination teams Dick Cheney talked about but didn't quite implement actually came to be under the Obama administration? And how did they now come to include American citizens among their targets? How did the drone war expand at an exponential rate since the Obama administration came to power? And how is it that the new administration, like the Bush administration, continues to invoke the state secrets privilege to keep all of these programs in place? And finally, how is it that the Obama administration has come to prosecute more whistleblowers and leakers than all previous administrations combined? So as cliche as it sounds, my work lately has been about trying to understand space and time. On one hand, I've been trying to understand what 21st century annihilations of space and time look like. Moreover, I've tried to understand how these annihilating forces become historic agents. In other words, how do the institutions and machines we've developed increasingly determine the nature of human activities? How do the ways that machines see come to be the ways in which we see? And are there any ways to harness this, to transform it? What are the possibilities for an ethical landscape in an increasingly post-human world? I've recently been working with hackers in an attempt to intercept video feeds from American surveillance aircraft around the world as they communicate with their handlers in the United States via a system of satellites using an unencrypted connection that you can kind of pull off the satellites. But thinking about space and time has led me not only to want to understand the 21st versions of what Marx famously called the annihilation of space with time, it has led me to want to see the obverse of that, namely the annihilation of time with space. In a lot of my projects, I use a spatial axis as an allegory for understanding ourselves, i.e. looking at things that are very, very distant, trying to see things that are very, very far away, trying to see the limits of vision. But more recently, I've become interested in a kind of temporal axis. Earlier this year, I walked into a liquor store in Cortez, Colorado, with a camera and a super telephoto lens slung around my back. "Wow," said the man behind the counter, "with that camera, I bet you could see into the future." Little did he know that's exactly what I was trying to do. And so I leave you with an image of ruins. On the left is an image that might be familiar to you. These are ancient cliff dwellings in the southwest, first photographed in the 19th century by Timothy O'Sullivan on what was called a reconnaissance survey for the Department of War. The people who once inhabited these structures destroyed their environment and their civilization around 1100 AD. Their ruins have become stranded in time, like an unmoving puddle that has become detached from the river of history. And yet, through their own brute materiality, they persist. On the right, we have a curiously similar image. It's a photograph of something called the Clark Belt, and these little flecks and pieces of our spacecraft. This is a ring of dead and dying communications and eavesdropping satellites that form a thin ring around the Earth at an altitude of about 23,000 miles. At this altitude, these machines are freed from the effects of atmospheric drag, and their orbits will remain stable in virtual perpetuity. These machines will slowly circle the Earth until the Earth itself is no more. Thank you.